Our next speaker is Sony Devabhaktuni, who is coming from Hong Kong to visit us. He teaches in the Department of Architecture at the University of Hong Kong, and he's presenting curb scale studies in Hong Kong.
All right, so first of all, I wanted to thank the organizers. It's been a great couple days, and today I'm going to be talking about a project which I call Curb Scale Studies in Hong Kong. It's a work that I began last summer as a response to my curiosity and fascination with the streets of Hong Kong, streets that were at that point and still today quite new to me. By the end of the talk, I hope that you'll understand what I mean by street and that I mean something very specific and perhaps specifically different from the more popular vision of Hong Kong's density, three-dimensional connectivity, and the awesome infrastructural engineering works that Hong Kong's usually recognized for. These, of course, are all still sources of wonder, but the street that I'm particularly fascinated with is the one that's underfoot, the ground on which I walk every day, that I climb, zigzag, trip, and stumble often. So I'll talk about this street and about some of the methods and ideas that motivate the project, which again is about a year old, so just beginning. And ultimately, the argument that the project is trying to make is that, and the drawings are trying to make, is that through a close description of the street at the curb scale, it's possible to begin to describe not only the chaotic ground underfoot, but also the relations between policy, protocols, norms, and use that regulates its fabrication. And this will to describe is ultimately motivated by an equal desire to identify whether it's possible in Hong Kong to assert a new set of priorities for the street that privilege human exchange, experience, and comfort over the domination of the automobile, mostly. So I'd like to talk about three books that situate the work. First, Walter Benjamin's Unfinished Arcades project, for me, proposes a way of looking at the city that's quite familiar to all of us and is relevant to the current work in at least three ways. First, in its reading of a depth within the material culture of urban life, from advertising, iron construction, interiors, and the naming of streets. Second, in its reading of this depth through the assemblage of written materials that are diverse in their origins and audiences. And finally, in Benjamin's relationship to Paris and the peripatetic wanderings that perhaps made possible a different appreciation for how the story of a city could be constructed, and importantly, an appreciation for how being able to cover a city on foot was related to the possibility for a civic quality of belonging. The second work is Bernard Rudofsky's 1969 Streets for People, a primer for Americans. While Rudofsky doesn't cite Benjamin in his survey of the role and history of the street in Europe and America, he does quote Hannah Arendt in her introduction to Illuminations to point out the very specific social and civic role of the street in Paris, and contrasting that to the dearth of human life on sidewalks in American suburbs. As a primer for American, Streets for People is a scolding directed not only toward the United States, but specifically towards New York, and what Rudofsky sees is an incapacity to apply European lessons for social relations and comfortable urban living. For Rudofsky, the street itself, comprising both the architecture of the city and the articulated volume that binds it together as a primary agent of this possibility. So both the architecture and that volume. His book takes apart the street, looking at its history, different street typologies, the priorities that have shaped it, and more closely at the details that contribute to its functioning. So some of the chapter headings: Streets for Pigs, the Canopied Street, What's in a Name, the street is where the action is, mazes, so each of them a chapter looking at a different aspect. In a chapter called Diamond Streets and Crystal Pavements, he writes, street pavements represent the low water mark of the urban environment, square miles of patched asphalt of no discernible texture and color, erratically perforated by metal grills through which escape the stenches of the sewers. Rudofsky lived in New York from 1935 until his death in 1988, but never missed an opportunity to escape a city and a country for which Streets for People suggests he had nothing but disappointment, almost dumbfounded by an urban culture driven by technocratic planning and laissez-faire economics to transform the built environment into a machine for the production of capital. So writing in 1968, he was in some sense living in a New York that was falling apart. I think he'd probably make the same critique even today in a very different city. This brings us then to Hong Kong, a city whose relatively brief history has been characterized by its role as a trading port, first of goods between its colonial overseers and the Chinese mainland, and more recently of the immaterial transactions of capital that propelled China's development into a global economic power. Hong Kong is, in a sense, the exemplar of the neoliberal city fabricated by a dynamic of top-down urban engineering and ad hoc contingent decision-making. In Cities Without Ground, a Hong Kong guidebook, the authors describe this as, quote, a unique collaboration between pragmatic thinking and comprehensive master planning played out in three-dimensional space. This three-dimensionality is such that the ground plane itself is indiscernible and has lost the significance that made it relevant as a zone of social and civic life in cities such as New York or Paris. The book makes its argument through a series of diagrams of these three-dimensional networks that borrow a graphic code from guide maps for shopping malls and the city's transport system. Space, time, and event are abstracted to describe a continuous network of movement and activity that renders the dense, seemingly chaotic city efficient, navigable, and lively, or full of some kind of life. So for example, in this drawing of Conant Road, there's icons which indicate businessmen banter, another one that indicates a permanent city bank protest. So if the ground here is abstracted into a code that makes it indistinguishable from underground networks and above-ground platforms, it still would nevertheless seem, the authors argue, to be the site of some kind of human exchange. Curb scale studies is therefore situated in discussion with these three works, sometimes as a reaction to their arguments, and more often as an attempt to continue what it might mean to describe the city, to describe Hong Kong, in order to understand how the experience of urban life is related to the street as a site of its making. In this description and in Hong Kong, the ground itself, the street underfoot, plays an important role in qualifying this experience. And when I speak of urban life and the space within which it takes place, I'm talking about two notions of space. The first we could understand as the trajectory of our everyday movements through a city. In physics, this vector, the vector describing the movement of a body over time is called its world line. This line is unique in that each point represents not only the three-dimensional spatial dimensions, but also the fourth dimension of time. And it's at each moment that this line is qualified by the world around us, the infinite multitude of sensory experiences that take place within a specific spatial environment. The overlay of the world line with the city itself forms a record of urban experience. The curb scale forms an interface within this overlay between our moving through the city and the city itself. It's the scale that comprises those elements of the street, its width, paving, obstacles, slope, etc., that qualify that movement. To clarify what is meant, what I mean by this, in Paul-Henri Chambert-Delot's well-known drawing from 1957, a young woman's daily circuit mapped over a year, we learn some things about the routines that characterize her life, the importance of her home, her university, and her music lessons, indicated as points at the ends of these vectors cutting through the city. Yet we don't learn exactly what path she chose each day, if it was the same one, or if she chose a specific path because of the quality of the street, who she might be able to run into on the corner, or whether there were benches to stop and read. Today, it's possible to create maps that provide a much closer tracking of our movements, giving us a sense of exactly which streets we took over any period of time. But still, the scale of such a map leaves out the details of why we may have chosen a certain side of the street to run, its width, the absence of obstacles, a particularly comfortable paving stone. In his introduction to Streets for People, Rudofsky suggests that a contemporary neglect of the street can be blamed on architects who draw it as the leftover white space between two lines. In order to understand how the street functions, the curb scale proposes a description that begins to address this blank space and the elements of its complexity. The project uses measured plan drawings at 1:150 as a way to record the curb scale. This mode of drawing, the plan, sets the work apart from some recent techniques that combine illustration, mapping, diagram, or the axonometric and rely less on one standard or normative techniques of orthogonal projection. In the Architectural Ethnography exhibition organized this summer at the Japan Pavilion of the Venice Biennial, the curators brought together 42 contemporary practices that use drawing in close relationship to fieldwork and the observation of the life both in the city and elsewhere. In an essay for the exhibition entitled "A Drawing is Not a Plan," Laurent Stauder and Andreas Kalpecki write that the geometrical basis of the orthogonal projections allows for the extrapolation of the information they contain, making them an accurate tool for communicating a design intention. But this has never stopped architects from reaching for alternative representational techniques to suit their particular needs. For the authors, these alternative kinds of drawings speak of an endless variety of perceptual worlds whose boundaries have to be measured and remeasured to get a fix on their individual temporal and spatial qualities. And indeed, the drawings included in the exhibition transform normative understandings of architectural drawing. As documentary records of observation and work in the field, they assert a different function for architecture itself. By choosing to use measured plan drawings for the curb scale, I'd like to propose that there is still a possibility to use orthographic projection in ways that speak of those immeasurable and perceptual qualities that characterize our experience of the city, while maintaining its frame of measure. Several choices are important to the way these drawings function. First, the scale at which the street is drawn forces a close observation of the elements that comprise it: the curb, the guardrail, the light pole, the manhole cover, the niche, the building entrance, the pavement. All of these elements that form the ground of our experience within the city become explicit. The scale not only allows the sighting of these elements in space, but also the identification of their attributes as specific objects, making possible a reading of the patchwork of cuts, additions, and fillings in that suggest a complex network of actors and decisions. Second, the drawings comprise several hundred meters of each case study street. This decision addresses the extreme heterogeneity of many streets in Hong Kong, which means that walking several hundred meters can evince constant shifts in experience. The regularity that one might find in a city such as Paris or New York is missing. This can be seen in the drawings as well, in those moments when that limit between the street and interior space is ambiguous, whether explicitly by design or through use and habit. Loading docks become shortcuts through buildings, ground floors of residential buildings house arcades, and service exits give directly onto the street, marked by niches which serve as temporary shelters. Finally, the drawings are largely devoid of two important elements: people and the things they bring with them. For the roadways, this includes the machines that fill the roads, and for the sidewalks, the daily occupation by the stores that line the street. For those of you who've been to Hong Kong or have an image of the city in mind from popular culture, one aspect of the street's vitality is the constant flow of people and the ways in which the street is dense with information. For the project, one critical question was whether we could suggest this flux and energy through the abstraction of the street into its constituent elements. In a sense, I wanted to understand if it was possible to describe the street as an object comprised of many objects, and whether these elements themselves, in their relation to each other, in their repetition, in their deployment and use, could begin to imply or suggest those things that were absent. Through this abstraction, I think it's additionally possible to begin to describe these elements or objects in the complexity of their organization, to narrate this complexity, and perhaps also to propose alternative scenarios for their relations. The drawings of the streets themselves form the center of the project, and I'd like to speak now about the method that leads to their construction. and talk about how the project using the drawings analytically to open up questions about how the city is fabricated. In order to make the drawing, we first had to determine what we meant by street. Was a street also a highway, a footpath, or an elevated walkway? What seemed important in the context of the project was to choose case studies where people and the automobile came into some degree of contact. While narrow alleys and pedestrian lanes offer a great deal of character to the city, the project was particularly concerned with how cars and people could share space. Nevertheless, this left a great degree of possibility, and we began by classifying different streets in Hong Kong based on a number of parameters that related to their dimensions, to their density, history, slope, linearity, etc. What we got then were some street types for which we tried to choose one exemplary case study. So for example, we have the topographic street, the hill street, the market street, etc. Second, we had to determine a way to document the streets that would allow us to make drawings. One of the difficulties that arises in many parts of Hong Kong is that satellite imaging technologies such as Google Earth are very limited use. For example, in the satellite image you see here, in cities like New York or Paris, you can glean some information about the street from those kinds of images. But in Hong Kong, due to its extreme topography and the height of its buildings, the city just becomes a mass of dense concrete. So the work of recording the streets took place using photographs and film that were taken over the course of numerous visits in a reiterative process of documenting and drawing. This process was informed by a desire to understand, measure, and detail without losing a larger sense of the whole. The drawings themselves began with cadastral plans that were available from the Hong Kong Planning Department, but very quickly these base drawings were transformed using the information recorded on the street. Distance was sometimes extrapolated from relational and proportional readings of the images and video, and other times measured on site and recorded as notes or indications on early drafts. Precision developed over time through checking, verifying, and returning to the site. The drawings that developed through this process became the basis for additional analysis that functioned through two categories of reading. First, a glossary of elements that identifies the objects that comprise the street and provides for each one a kind of taxonomy of the ways in which these objects appear and function. For example, manhole covers, guardrails, planters of different shapes and sizes. The glossary collects these together into their respective categories and offers both an explanation of what links them and what distinguishes them. Second are moments within the case study drawings that are looked at more closely as constellations of elements. Here, what's interesting is to identify where spatial relations point to an issue that can be understood by looking at the administrative decisions that regulate the fabrication of the street, the protocols that manage it, or the ways in which the street is appropriated. In some sense, these constellations make it possible to narrate the larger forces that are at play, as well as the priorities underlying these forces. Both the glossary and the constellations become a way to take primary research into the administrative technocratic structure of the street's fabrication and management and give it a certain legibility. Telling stories about the street through the curb scale allows us to describe the city and perhaps begin to identify moments where there's a possibility for proposing new ways of designing its elements. Description thereby becomes the eventual basis for a program of rethinking the street in Hong Kong and the equilibrium between people and cars that governs it today. In this sense, the work is also a response to planning models that have reigned over cities for much of the last century and the more recent attempt to challenge those models with new forms of participative urbanism. If participation is a kind of bottom-up process that brings a new set of actors and priorities into the fabrication of cities, perhaps the curb scale can be a way of drawing and describing the city that can play a role in that process. Rather than master plans, typical sections, or the offloading of public responsibility for the street toward private developers, the curb scale describes an aspect of everyday experience in a way that I hope could allow us to consider and transform it. Thank you.
Sony. Does anyone have a question for Sony? You're so all quiet. Okay.
I don't know if there might be a question at the end of my comment, and I hope I can formulate this, because thank you, very good presentation. I can also, there's a lot of connections with the way I work as well. I'm quite taken in making some far-fetched link between your presentation and Danielle's, who started the day in that we saw in one presentation, we saw a sort of method of imagining something almost impossible, fantastical, that comes from accruing an urban situation from the architecture, and that becomes something almost fantastical, almost too big to manage. And in a way, Hong Kong lends itself to that kind of model of urbanism. And in your presentation, you bring us right back down to something that might be completely left or taken for granted. So really the ground on which I think I really appreciate is sort of like the combination of these two. And by showing Benjamin, you bring it to something that is also quite materialistic. And I'm wondering, I'm going to try to formulate a question. I don't know how this is going to go, because like in bringing up Benjamin, sorry, you bring up that to me the idea that that what you're presenting might be some sort of refuse of the modernity or the urbanism that Danielle may have presented. That we're interested in something that could be left aside or taken for granted or not actually seen. It's not a question, it's a comment, but I wonder if you have something to bring back Benjamin in as something that what you're looking at as a sort of a refuse of the city that you're looking at.
I mean, I think in my experience of the street in Hong Kong or the ground, it really is a kind of refuse or a leftover, even in the center of the city, in the way that so much of planning has been about the efficient movement of people through space, usually on elevated walkways or through buildings, so that almost the ground is something that is, isn't meant to be touched. But nevertheless, it is the site of all kinds of interactions, and it's important to how you move through the city. So it is this kind of, not forgotten necessarily, but a space that's not considered in the same way that all of these other infrastructures have been so celebrated and designed in the past 20, 30 years.
Another question? Yes, Daniel.
You bring me into the game. Yeah, thanks for the presentation. One question to the qualitative aspects of this classification. Like you bring out then at the end, like you have a catalog of typologies of these kind of streets, but also like Hong Kong is not only a city of a lifted ground, but also actually of the street restaurants, street shops. So it has very specific qualities actually already, which are more relating to a social or to kind of neighborhood models, whatever. But you don't talk about that. It's very formal, your assessment. Mm-hmm. So despite that, what makes Hong Kong for you so specific then, in different states from other cities? Like why you locate your research then into Hong Kong?
I think because of the natures of the street as something that's in a way a kind of a space that's not designed. A space where there's so many different administrative and government actors involved in the fabrication of the street without any overall kind of plan that goes into how it's realized. Sometimes when you're walking in Hong Kong, you'll know instantly when you've moved through a part of the street that's been made by a developer, because it has a totally different character from the street which has been left over for public fabrication. So in the sense that the street in Hong Kong has a very specific quality, which is about this ad hoc process of fabrication. This ad hoc, I describe it as contingent, based on what needs to be done, what can be done, different actors taking it apart, putting it back together. in a way that I think is specific to Hong Kong, but maybe perhaps also other parts of Asia, and very different from a place like Paris or even New York, where there's much more, I think, stringent guidelines about how that takes place. But also going back to your question about the kind of street stalls and the restaurants, those as elements of the street, I think I'm also interested in, certainly in the way that the government and the planning department and the health department actually regulates the designs of those stalls, how they need to be organized within the street, closed up, opened out, so that there are other kinds of protocols which regulate those, and they will, in that sense, become part of the drawing. But as something, as I mentioned, there aren't people in the drawing, so those kind of social interactions that I think are also very important are ones that I hope that looking at the street in this other kind of way could make us consider differently.
I just wanted to ask you, going back to the drawings,
Yeah.
drawing pretty much a technical plan,
Yeah.
or so it seems. What I find interesting about this choice of representation is that the way you explain the making of the street, that's very kind of complex, ad hoc. We don't know who's in charge of what, and it changes. You cross the street, it's something else completely. Yeah. And the sort of technical drawing kind of, I wouldn't say flatten, but kind of homogenize everything and allows one to really think about the infrastructure per se, and not so much about how it is being made. Where so far in the yesterday and today, we're seeing drawings that try to show how complex and the interaction and all this. And I appreciate that there are no people in your drawings, and to me the question of having people in didn't even come up, like it didn't cross my mind, because it makes so much sense that it's a plan that looks at the infrastructure and not at the experience. Or so I don't know if you can talk about this technical drawing as a means really to explain the nature of it.
I mean, this notion of time or different agents or different actors, one of the things that we've still been struggling with is how to, in a way, represent those different qualities of operation onto the street within the drawings. So for example, I think you can see it much better in the drawings in the exhibition, but the sidewalk's always textured in the many different ways that it gets textured, because the city decides that it needs to be paved a certain way and then changes its mind, and the next block is done a different way. So that those textures become not only just a kind of hatch that's representing a texture, but literally the ground that's been put into place. So in that sense, that maybe patchwork is one way. And I think also the cuts of the street are also something that's quite important in terms of how they signify or talk about the different operations into it. So that quality that you're describing is something that I think we'd like to arrive at, so that it doesn't feel homogeneous, but does have that tension between those two aspects.
Yeah, it's about the process of its making.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Son.
Thank you.